Hi everyone, thank you for the opportunity to speak at New Alternatives. It feels like a great honour to be asked to present today at your conference. I hope it's the start of something new and significant for people with a psychosocial disability in Korea, and may bring about change and reform to the mental health system in your country. Okay, so I'm speaking today from Melbourne, Australia. It's early morning, it's raining, and we're in full lockdown because of COVID-19 restrictions. Now, it's definitely the first time I've ever done a presentation like this via Zoom to a conference, so please excuse me if there are a few clunky moments, but I'm just going to go with them and hopefully it'll all work out fine. Okay, right. Before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I'm meeting with you today, the Aboriginal people, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. In my talk today, I'll be sharing some personal reflections about the peer movement in Australia, which is often also referred to as the consumer movement, or to be more embracing, the consumer survivor expansion movement. Within this movement, as within other social, civil and human rights movements, there is much going on which together collectively informs us as a movement where we are at and where we need to go. In my speech today, I'll be talking about the history of the peer movement in Australia, where the peer movement is now, and what are some of the services, supports, and activities that can assist people along their recovery journeys. I'll also be talking about what needs to change so that people with a psychosocial disability find their rightful place as valued and contributing members of our societies. Okay, so firstly, a little bit about myself. My name is Neil, and I am an NDIS manager at Victorian Mental Illness Awareness Council. What that means is I manage a team of mental health advocates who work with people with a psychosocial disability. I also have a lived experience that goes back over 40 years to my teenage years, when I was 20 years old, I spent a lot of time, I think over a year, in a psych hospital in Melbourne. When I left with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, a prescription, and not a great deal much more. And throughout my 20s and into my early 30s, I bounced around a lot in the mental health system, going through periods of being well and being able to do things, and then finding my life kind of collapsing in on myself and finding myself homeless and ending up in hospital. A bit of a revolving door scenario. Yeah, so through that, and through my kind of work since in the mental health system, I've been actively working in the mental health system for the past 20 years. I guess I have some pretty mixed feelings about mental health and psychiatry. I'm not against it. I feel it has a place, but it certainly shouldn't have the place or the prominence that it has currently. All right, so I might just share a cartoon. Bear with me, please. Okay, I've got it. Okay, wonderful. Right. Okay. All right. So this is my presentation, and that picture that you're seeing there, it's a picture of the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, taken from the Aero course, and there you can see a kind of pretty curious coral formation. It may have been Photoshopped, but I'm not sure. But there you go. That's one of the great national treasures of Australia, and a bit of Australiana for you all. So enjoy. Okay, so as I was saying, the mental health system in Australia, it's really. This is a cartoon by Miranda Epstein, who's a colleague and a wonderful friend of mine. Miranda Epstein is kind of like the godmother of the consumer movement in Australia, and she's a cartoonist, radical thinker, amazing person in general, pioneer in the consumer movement. I could go on and on about her, but yeah, I just love this cartoon. It's called Desperation, and as you can see, it's got two people scaling the walls of the psychiatric system. One person is desperately trying to get in, and the second person is desperately trying to get out. And to me, that says a lot about our mental health systems and the support that we offer to people currently. It's an old cartoon, but nothing's changed. I can guarantee you that. Well, maybe things have changed a little bit. They haven't changed enough. Okay, that's me being kind of magnanimous. Okay. Okay, so when I was in my 20s, I was told that because of my diagnosis of schizophrenia, it was likely that I'd never be able to work, maintain a relationship, have a family, raise children, and have the type of future that I thought I was going to have. That was crushing and sent me into deep despair that took years to get over. It kind of inculcated in me, I suppose, a sense of kind of inferiority and worthlessness as a person. And it is also part of what, we can call the soft bigotry of low expectations that exists in the mental health system, and is part of the culture and fabric of a psychiatric system that hides its own failings and shortcomings under a cloak of benevolence and paternalism. It was around this time, so I got out of hospital, I went to the country and did some work on farms and returned to Melbourne, and then I met Anne, who was someone who I'd known before I'd gotten unwell, who I used to go out with when I was 17. And Anne then, at the age of 31, became my partner for the next 25 years. Anne, who sadly is no longer with us, was a key figure in my life. Anne was a filmmaker, writer, and poet who had a very, very political take on life, and who enabled and supported me to grow and look at my life differently. And Anne was into outsiders and the outsider perspective, and was an outsider herself. And we spent a lot of time together living in the country, reading and talking and plotting and scheming and reading a lot of psychology books, books on mental health, from critical thinkers like Zars, Cooper, Lang, Goffman, and Foucault. And my time away and the input of these different narratives allow me to construct my own kind of story about what had happened, my own story and understanding of what I've been through in my ongoing journey from illness to recovery. Though I'm not really here today to share too much more about my own personal story, what I will say is that without the care and support of my peers, and that being other people with a lived experience of mental illness and distress, I very much doubt I would be here today or doing what I'm doing. That is just an absolute guarantee, that one. And more than anything else, it has been the example, guidance, mutual support, and inspiration that I've gained through my contact with my peers in the consumer movement that has enabled me to overcome the barriers, challenges, and discrimination that I have continued to face through my life. Okay, so that really brings me around to the topic of my talk today, which is around the peer movement in Australia. And as you will hear, it's a movement that has been around for a while now, and which, though I guess small in size, is kind of growing in influence and support, as its importance is being recognised both within mental health and across the wider community. Okay, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the history of the consumer movement in Australia, and this is the front cover of a publication by Miranda. It's her memoir, or one of her memoirs, I guess, and it's a bit of a kind of like exploration of the consumer movement in Australia. Miranda was the main person at Our Consumer Place, which was funded by the state government to build the capacity of people in Victoria to understand about the peer movement and consumer movement, peer and consumer movement. And it's got a whole host of resources on the Our Consumer website that are just, absolute kind of treasure troves and just awesome, and highly recommended that you go there and have a look. So in Australia, the consumer movement began in the heady and radical civil rights days of the mid-70s, and so its first manifestation was in kind of organisations like the Victorian Association of Psychiatric Patients and the Campaign Against Psychiatric Injustice and Coercion, which was known as CAPIC and VAP. In Miranda Epstein's memoirs, she writes beautifully about these times. So I'm just going to read a little bit of someone else's words rather than just a nice thing to do. So Miranda writes that CAPIC, or the Campaign Against, the Campaign Against Psychiatric Injustice and Coercion, represented a very radical and anti-psychiatry position. Its members would turn up at all sorts of official events and demand change. Demand that psychiatrists be sued for harm caused by a variety of contemporary practices. I also know that they did some other stuff, like kind of getting people out, breaking people out of psych hospitals, supporting them to kind of disappear back into their community. as Marina says, you know, there were many other radical groups fighting for human rights at this time. It was an era that I wish I could have stayed with forever, but that is history. But that is not how history works. CAPIC was the right movement of its time. Many small activism groups were supported by the non-government sector. In those days, the psychiatric disability support sector was poor and radical. We could rely on impoverished small organisations to house us, support us, and even help us charge the barricades of the service system. We had a common enemy out there rather than an enemy within, which is all too common these days, regardless of the employment of consumers within the sector. All of these groups were also supported by a highly politicised university students sector, and that was the 70s, quite a radical time. So over time, as Australia moved out of the 70s and into the 80s, mental health activism, consumer activism took a new turn and began trying to change the mental health system from within. So, 1 second. In 1981, in the International Year of the Disabled, the organisation that I work for, the Victorian Mental Illness Awareness Council, was formed by a small group of activists as a means to bring people with a diagnosis of mental illness into the public consciousness. It was in protest that in the International Year of the Disabled, during a time when hundreds of events were being held across Australia to promote the civil and human rights of disabled people across Australia, there had been absolutely no recognition or awareness given to the terrible disadvantage experienced by people with psychosocial disability, many of whom were still living in institutional settings or else living very precariously in the community. Moving forward, in the mid-1980s, a groundbreaking participatory action research project sprung out of Victorian Mental Illness Awareness Council, or VMIC as it's called. So this project was called the Understanding Involvement, or UNI project, and it was and it took place in a large psychiatric institution called Royal Melbourne Hospital, where that was the place where I spent a year. And out of that participatory action research project, there were reams of books, and it kind of created a range of ways whereby patients and staff of the hospital were able to evaluate their experiences. So it was a very influential project and a bit of a world first, absolutely. And over time, it kind of like became apparent that something needed to be done to change the culture and practices of the mental health system. And this change needed to be led by consumers. Moving forward a few years later to 1991, in response to some horrendous stories of a great tragedy that took place in a psychiatric hospital in New South Wales. And it was around the use of a very controversial deep sleep treatment program, insulin therapy, something like that. And quite a few of the patients died under that treatment. When this tragedy was unearthed, the Australian government called a full inquiry and appointed Australia's mental health human rights, appointed Australia's Human Rights Commissioner to run a Royal Commission inquiry into mental health. So out of this kind of massive inquiry into mental health, there came a number of recommendations, but one of the most important was the need moving forward for the participation and involvement of consumers and carers being family members, I guess, in the evaluation, design and delivery of mental health services. Kind of a case of nothing about us without us. So moving forward even more, by the mid-90s, the first kind of peer or kind of consumer roles were created within the mental health system, and they were roles for people with a lived experience to effectively work as change agents within the psychiatric system, and to capture patient experiences and feedback about how services could be improved as a form of quality improvement for the mental health system. So by 2000, the year 2000, when I first started working in the mental health sector, consumer roles started appearing outside of the kind of psychiatric system in more progressive psychosocial rehabilitation support service settings. Now, these services were operated by non-government organisations and operated from a more strengths-based, recovery-focused kind of approach. Around the same time in 2000, the first kind of fully peer-run and operated peer support program started in Queensland. It was called the Book Read Centre, and a few years later, in 2006, Melbourne University's Centre for Psychiatric Nursing and Excellence created a bit of a world first, a consumer academic role, whose role was to provide consumer perspective training to graduate mental health nurses. Moving forward again, in 2008, the first consumer policy position was created within the Victorian government. So that was around kind of creating policy around the consumer movement in Victoria's mental health system. And in 2010, Voices Vic, which was established and with a grant to provide peer-led training on the Hearing Voices peer support approach. And it worked very hard over the next few years to establish the Hearing Voices movement in Australia. Very influential. In 2015, in Victoria and a lot of other states, a lot of funding started flowing into supporting peer workers to work within the psychiatric hospital system, particularly in the discharge, post-hospital discharge kind of area, supporting people with their transition from hospital to home. And probably the other thing I'd have to say is that over the past 20 years, like the influence of the internet, Facebook, and other social media has really changed the way that that people here in Australia have learned about and viewed peer work. It's allowed many people with their own lived experience of mental illness to connect together around a common cause. And people right across Australia, thousands of them, are tapping into the peer movement and its messages in new and very different ways. So kind of now we're at a time where the kind of peer, the informal, the peer movement has kind of like matured in Australia to a certain extent. We have people working in paid positions right across Australia as peer workers. There are a range of other roles also. Oh, that's a timeline, sorry. Yeah, so there's a timeline about the consumer movement. But just moving forward, here we are now. Here's the consumer movement now. People, and this is a lovely little graphic that's been kind of created by a couple of peer consumers, a consumer academic and a worker at the Centre for Mental Health Learning, and it's really kind of encompasses where the peer movement is that's where it is within the mental health system. There's also a wider peer movement that exists in our community, but within the mental health system, peer work, or as it's known now, lived experience work, occupies a number of different roles and tasks. You can see there, some of those roles include systemic advocacy, individual advocacy, training of the mental health workers, policy work, peer support work, and supervision and leadership, and last but definitely not least, research and evaluation by lived experience workers. Whoops. Okay, there are some excellent, easily accessible resources that you can get on the peer movement in Australia. I have one link there below to the Centre for Mental Health Learning website, but I would also highly recommend the lived experience framework, which was kind of created with funding from Queensland Mental Health by a team of consumer academics from RMIT or RMIT University. Okay, so I might just stop sharing for a minute or two and pause for a second. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about supporting people on their recovery journeys, and what does that mean in a peer sense. And I guess a core belief of the consumer movement that's very central to people is that people can and do recover, and that to facilitate that, you need to provide services and opportunities that can really assist people on their recovery journey. And that's really vital because the disconnection, confusion, anxiety, and feelings of hopelessness brought on by mental ill health and the way that we treat people with a mental illness can feel crushing and just too much to bear. There are many issues of concern for people with a psychosocial disability, and a lot of them relate to being part of a community or population of people who experience marginalization, discrimination, neglect, and lack of understanding. And some of these issues relate to our health. People, I think the research in Australia is that people with a mental illness, with a serious mental illness, their life expectancy is something like 20 years less than the rest of the population. But you know, these issues impact on people on pretty much every area of their life, and you know, they're really it's around the lack of support that people receive, and how our civil and human rights can be restricted, taken away from us, or violated. And you know, some of the other kind of things that are happening for people are around the kind of the feelings of isolation and social disadvantage that and lack of opportunity that are a consequence of losing our place as people in our society. And you know, importantly, these are all matters that a peer movement needs to fight on and seek to address. They're really the most important things that the peer movement needs to do moving forward. When we are told we are broken, when we are told we are unwell, when we are not respected, wanted, or heard, it's easy to start to believe that our life is, that the life we have is the life that we deserve. And so we need places, we need services, we need people who can turn some of this thinking around for people. And you know, it's been my experience and the experience of many other people in Australia that this can happen in many ways. But you know, really it starts with the premise of not undervaluing people or their potential. You know, it's you know, integral to this is also having a place to go and to have opportunities in life, whatever they may be, where they might arise. But having a place to go, feeling heard and understood, and feeling part of the community, you know, all those things are super, super important. You know, and as peers, as people with a lived experience of mental illness, we need places where we can meet and talk, where we can be with other people and realize that our problems are not insurmountable, but are just part of being human. So, so in Australia, we have some fantastic peer-developed and run groups that have moved right away from the siloed and institutional welfare thinking and practices of the mental health system. Sorry, I'm just going to bring up another slide. Yeah, so and you know, a lot of these groups, they happen in the community. They're led by consumer peer activists who really want to change the system. You know, and they might be activities that just around social connection and inclusion, or they may have an arts focus, like this flyer here we have from Skizzy Inc., which is a very kind of like radical collective of artists and political people in Melbourne, and they run something called the Mojo Film Festival. It runs every year, and it's an opportunity for people to learn about. They have lessons where they teach people how to make short films, and then they have a film night, and started off in a shop front, and now is in it's now in one of the kind of more prestige cinemas in Melbourne. Yeah, so like peer support activities that can make a difference, and some of them are do have an art focus, and it might be around where you can learn how to make a short film or record some music, or maybe even pick up a paintbrush for the first time in 20 years. Other groups and other opportunities kind of focus more on peer support or mutual support, and these can be places where people can learn new ways about talking about and understanding their own experiences and being with other people. Other really important services for people with psychosocial disability definitely are advocacy services. As I mentioned earlier, I work for an advocacy service, Victorian Mental Illness Awareness Council. And we have teams of advocates who provide advocacy support and referral assistance to people with a psychosocial disability. And they're around, whatever the matters are, they're really pressing in their lives, whether that be around their mental health, finances, housing, legal matters, or conflict with services, supports, or institutions. Can be a whole gamut of things. But having someone who, in a sense, kind of knows what you're going through, kind of can feel a little bit what it feels to be in your shoes, and kind of can be there to support you, and it's not going to judge you by the way you present or talk or whatever. That's really, really important work, and what people with a psychosocial disability really need above all else. Okay. All right, so I'm getting near the end of this kind of presentation, and so it's really just some time for some final thoughts. Okay, so we are now at a point in time where it's super important for marginalised and oppressed people right across the globe, and for particularly for people living with a psychosocial disability, to find their own ways of speaking up and telling their truths. In doing so, we need to shine a light on practices in mental health that are wrong and harmful, like seclusion, involuntary detention, and so forth. And from our own experiences, we hold the expertise about what works and what needs to change. People with a lived experience, people with a psychosocial disability really do need to lead change in mental health. And our advocacy for change needs to come through in whatever way we can, and whatever work we can do. And the best way we can make change happen is by being the change that we want to see, by speaking up and being prominent in our societies and supporting the views and perspectives of people with a psychosocial disability, to be known and understood. Yes, so that's all I really had to say today, but I really do want to thank you once again for the opportunity to speak, and I really look forward to taking some questions from the audience at New Alternatives. So thank you so very much, and speak to you soon. Bye.